Hello, everybody, and welcome to an article analysis video here on the channel where I will be breaking down Who's the Beatdown by Mike Flores. It is widely regarded as one of, if not the best, strategy articles ever written for Magic the Gathering, but it was written in 1999, which means a lot of the references to cards and decks that it makes aren't really as widely known as they once were. And so in this video, I'm going to be going through the article and explaining the more complicated references so that the true strategical brilliance of the article can shine through and every player can gain the insight that Mike Flores is teaching, because it really is a huge level up moment when you read this article and understand its concepts. If you do enjoy this sort of video where I go through these articles, let me know and I'll do more of them in the future. So, who is the beatdown? Who's the beatdown, as they would say? The most common, yet subtle, yet disastrous mistake I see in tournament Magic is the misassignment of who is the beatdown deck and who is the control deck in a similar deck versus similar deck matchup. The player who misassigns himself is inevitably the loser. You see, in similar deck versus similar deck matchups, unless the decks are really symmetrical, i.e. the true mirror match, one deck has to play the role of beatdown and the other deck has to play the role of control. This can be a very serious dilemma if, say, both are playing aggressive decks. Let me give you an example. At a 1x PTQ, which means that there's one slot for the Pro Tour in the tournament, in Washington, D.C., my teammate Al Tran was playing for a top 8 slot versus Sly. Sly is the name for mono red aggro. I believe it is named after Paul Sly, who brought it to a 1996 PTQ, and it kind of revolutionized the way people thought about mono red aggro or just aggro decks in general, because he was playing a lot of cards that people thought were like kind of bad, but he was playing a consistent curve and he had some burn spells, and so he just kind of built one of, if not the first, like major aggro decks, and so they named it after him. So Sly means mono red aggro. Al was playing Landitro-Hose White Weenie / Jank deck, normally an aggressive deck, but not versus Sly. White Weenie in this context does not mean mono white. In modern day Magic the Gathering, White Weenie often means mono white, but Jank is what their word for Boros was. So this was a red-white deck. So that's worth knowing as well. And just from a macro level sense, in modern day Limited, you would kind of expect that the red-white deck would have a little bit higher power level than just the mono-red deck, and would sacrifice a little bit of consistency and speed maybe to get that higher power level just because of being two colors and therefore a less consistent mana base. The match was split 1-1, and the third game was going to determine who made top 8. Al's opponent went first and laid a Jackal Pup. So this is exactly the sort of card I was talking about when I was mentioning why Sly was a revolutionary deck. 1 mana for a 2/1 with obvious downsides turned out to be good enough in those days of Magic the Gathering, just because 1 mana for a 2-powered creature was quite good. At this point, Al had 2 Cursed Scrolls. Cursed Scroll is this card that is kind of a like mid to late game way to control the board of small creatures and just slowly deal damage to kill your opponent, because you can eventually just have like only like lands in your hand, so you just know exactly that you're going to choose a card at random, but it's going to be the card that you name because you only have that card in your hand. So Al had 2 Cursed Scrolls, 2 Swords to Plowshares, which is one of the best removal spells ever printed. It does have the downside of gaining the opponent life, but it's well worth the cost. 1 mana to exile, instant speed. And an Honorable Passage and some land in hand. Honorable Passage looks like a weird card, but it is, I believe, just a sideboard card for the mono red matchup, specifically against Ball Lightning. Ball Lightning is this card that was very good, 3 mana, and it basically does 6 damage to the opponent because it comes in with Trample Haste, and then it sacrifices itself. But if you use an Honorable Passage, the next time it would deal damage. You prevent that damage so you don't take the 6, and if you prevent the 6 from the red source, it deals 6 damage to them. So it's a huge reversal play for this sort of matchup where you're both kind of an aggressive deck, and so this seems like it was a sideboard card for specifically the Ball Lightning decks, because that's just an absolute blowout. So he had an Honorable Passage, instant land in hand. Al chose not to plow the Jackal Pup, taking 2 on the first attack. His opponent played another pup. Al didn't plow either, waiting on scroll mana or a lightning bolt. So as you can see, it's a red-white deck because it has Swords to Plowshares, but it also does have lightning bolts in it. It is obviously better to lightning bolt a Jackal Pup, because then when it's dealt that 3 damage, it'll deal that 3 damage also to the player controlling it. So on his own second turn, Al played another land and a Cursed Scroll, so he only had 1 land up. On his opponent's third turn, you guessed it, another mountain, because obviously you guessed it, it's mono red, followed by Ball Lightning. So the aforementioned play, Al was forced to plow the ball. He gained control over the next few turns, but ended up dying to bolts. So because he only had that one land up, he was not able to cast the honorable passage on the ball lightning as he would have wanted, and he instead had to use Sword to Plowshares, which is not the way you want your cards to line up. What was the problem here? Al was a beatdown deck, and he wanted to deal damage to his opponent via the Jackal Pups. However, in this particular matchup, he had to play the control deck. You see, Sly is just much faster than Jank, so Jank's way to win has to be stifling Sly's early speed with removal. Remember, Sly is mono red, Jank is red white. And then locking down the mid game with Cursed Scrolls. Because Sly also has Cursed Scrolls, it's just a good reach card for the mono red deck as well as more bolts than Jank. The only way that Jank can win is to make sure that it has a decent life total as it plays its own threat cards. Though it ostensibly hurts the initial race to give the Sly player 4 additional life from the Jackal Pups, because they would gain 2 life per Jackal Pup if you Swords to Plowshares them. You can see, because as you can see, this card, its controller gains life equal to its power, and Jackal Pup has 2 power. Gain 4 additional life from the Jackal Pups. You can see from this example that Al had to give him 6 more life from the Ball Lightning, and still took at least 8 from the Pups before he could control them. It would have profited Al much more to plow the Pups, passage the ball, and enter the mid-game with 20 life as he started to threaten with his own paladins, priests, etc. The same comparison can be made when 2 control-based decks slug it out. At the same PTQ, I was playing High Tide. High Tide is a combo deck that uses High Tide to make your islands tap for additional mana, and then it uses untap effects to tap your mana, untap those lands, tap them for even more mana, and then eventually go infinite using Palinchron, which can bounce itself to its owner's hand and then replay itself to untap lands. So if you have 6 islands in play, you can tap 1 to play High Tide, tap the other 5 for 10 mana, play Palinchron, untap your 6 lands, tap them for 12 mana, bounce the Palinchron to your hand for 4 mana, play it for 7, that nets you 1 mana, you untap the lands, repeat that loop infinite times, generate infinite mana, and then you eventually stroke your opponent out, which means that you kill them with Stroke of Genius, which is a X draw spell that can target either player. So you just make them draw their entire deck size plus 1, and so they immediately lose the game. So it's a combo deck. I was playing High Tide against what is normally a dangerous matchup for me, Counter Sliver. Counter Sliver is a deck that locks people out of the game by using Worship, which means that they, if they would reduce your life total to less than 1, it reduces it to 1 instead. And then it also uses Crystalline Sliver, which means that your slivers can't be the target of spells or abilities, so your opponent can't really kill your creatures. And then you have Cursed Scroll as a way to eventually just kill your opponent by just dealing 2 to them over the course of the game. So that's kind of that sort of control deck, locking them out. My opponent was running the usual array of slivers, Worship, and Permission. Permission means counter magic, as well as Cursed Scroll. He made the mistake of thinking he was the control deck. After playing a turn 2 Crystalline Sliver, he followed up 2 turns later with Worship, so I stroked him out. I killed him the first game with Palinchron, and because I mostly showed him Disrupts, Force Spikes, and card drawing, so Disrupt is a counter spell. Force Spike is also a counter spell, so both of them counter unless they pay 1. And card drawing, he may have thought I was more creature heavy. It doesn't matter. He thought he was the control deck in this matchup when clearly I was the control deck. I had a comparable or greater amount of permission, but where he had slivers, I had card drawing and deck manipulation. Where he had dual lands, I had Thawing Glaciers. So Thawing Glaciers is a way to eventually just start drawing extra cards from your mana base, because you can just start getting extra basic lands. So it comes into play tapped, and then you can pay mana to search your library for a basic land and put it into play tapped, and then you return Thawing Glacier to your owner's hand. But you're able to eventually use your land as a card advantage engine. My thaws were going to ensure that I never missed a land drop. I had already housed a couple of his brainstorms with that's just such a funny sentence to read. I had already housed a couple of his brainstorms, so brainstorm being a cantrip, very powerful, with Disrupt. This means that I was going to win the long game every single time. His job, therefore, was to kill me before I killed him. The normal formula is to play some decent-sized slivers, 2 power or more, attacking every turn and leaving mana open to try to counter whatever the opposing blue deck does that might be threatening you. You know, a Wrath of God, destroy all creatures, Engineered Plague, so pretty good against slivers because you just -1/-1 to all of them, or in this case, the High Tide finishing combo. First of all, he probably should have tried to threaten me more aggressively. Only 1 crystalline gets me a lot of turns of thawing and card drawing. thawing being using Thawing Glaciers. Secondly, tapping out is the Death Knell. I didn't even have to waste a Turnabout on him. So Turnabout is really good in this High Tide combo deck because you can use it to tap all of your opponent's lands on their end step and then untap and combo kill them. It's also really good with High Tide, so if you have to do some digging to find your Palinchron or other combo pieces, you can play your High Tide and then Turnabout yourself to tap all your mana and then untap all of your lands and use it as a huge cantrip. So it can generate a lot of mana in the mid to late game if you're using it in that way. So they didn't even have to waste a Turnabout on them, which means Mike could use it to just generate mana for himself. In similar deck versus similar deck matchups, there are a couple of things that you want to look at to figure out what role to play. 1, who has more damage? Usually he has to be the Beatdown deck. 2, who has more removal? Usually he has to be the control deck. 3, who has more permission and card drawing? Almost always he has to be the control deck. This makes a lot of sense intuitively speaking. If you have more damage, you are going to be faster, and so you're going to be the Beatdown deck. If you have more removal, you're going to be able to deal with your opponent's threats easier, and you're going to be the control deck. And if you have more permission and card drawing, then your opponent is almost forced into the Beatdown role because they're going to lose the long game to the deck that has more permission and card drawing. So that's the deck that's going to want to be the control deck, and then the opponent is going to want to be the Beatdown. If you are the Beatdown deck, you have to kill your opponent faster than he can kill you. If you are the control deck, you have to weather the early beatdown and get into a position where you can gain card advantage. For an example of correctly determining who is the beatdown deck and who is the control deck, look at the Sly versus Sly match, so mono red versus mono red, match between Price and Pacifico at the top 8 of the 1998 US Nationals. Although on the surface the two players seem to be playing very similar decks, there are major design differences. Dave's deck was running more Cursed Scrolls, we've already talked about this card, than Pacifico's, and he also had Hammer of Begarden. So my camera's blocking it, but Hammer of Begarden is basically a 3-mana burn spell that does 3 damage to target creature or player. Oh, cool, I can scroll down like this and then it'll show up. Perfect, I'm a genius. I am a genius. So it deals 3 damage to target creature or player for 1 red, and then you can return it from your graveyard to your hand during your upkeep. So in the late game, you're just going to be able to throw 3 damage around. You had Hammer of Begarden and Fire Slinger, so will deal 1 damage to any target and 1 damage to you. So this is really good against things like Jackal Pup because it just kills them and then sticks around. His only real beatdown was Jackal Pup and Ball Lightning. The rest of the deck was more control and utility oriented. Pacifico's deck was much more damage oriented. It was based around attacking and celerity creatures instead of dedicated removal. In addition to Jackal Pup and Ball Lightning, he had Goblin Vandal, so 1 mana 1/1, and you can destroy target artifact they control. Which is pretty good because that's good against the people playing Cursed Scrolls. But yeah, Mog Flunkies, so 2 mana 3/3, but it needs some extra help. Sukata Lancer and Viashino Sandstalker, so it's just 3 mana 4/2 that doesn't stay in play. Furthermore, Pacifico's deck lacked Fire Slinger and Hammer of Begarden and ran only 3 Cursed Scrolls, so just clearly a worse deck for the late game. While Dave's deck could definitely get a quick start, in this matchup, his deck was the control deck set up for the long game. In one duel, Dave just played land and scrolls and did very little else. He started by removing Pacifico's creatures with blocks or bolts, and then scroll locked him, gaining a little card advantage, and finished the game. Had Dave tried to race Pacifico, he might not have won. When 2 players are just blindly throwing their creatures into one another, the one with more damage-oriented cards is going to win the race. But I figure we expect good slide play from the King of Red. So, Dave is apparently the King of Red. So, what's his name? Dave Price is the King of Red. That's a cool nickname to have. Cool little bit of Magic history. While Dave's deck could definitely, and finish the game. I don't know. Finally, think about the Suicide Black versus Sly matchup. Suicide Black is a really weird deck because a lot of old black creatures had like downside text of you losing life, and so it was called Suicide Black because while you were killing your opponent, you were also like killing yourself by dealing damage to yourself. These are both very fast beatdown decks. Sly invariably wins. Which deck has more damage? Suicide Black. It runs many high power to cost creatures like Carnophage, so 1 mana 2/2, but you pay 1 life every turn. Sarcomancy, 1 mana, you get a 2/2, but if that 2/2 ever dies, then it deals 1 damage to you. And sometimes Flesh Reaper, which is a 2 mana 4/4 that when it deals damage, also deals the damage to yourself. So pretty crazy stats, but also really like deals a lot of damage to yourself. Sometimes it has stuff like Hatred. It damages even itself, so you pay X life to buff your creatures. Which deck has more removal? Sly. If Suicide Black even runs Cursed Scrolls, the Sly deck can invariably match them. Moreover, the Sly deck has not just weenies, but bolts. Though Sly is very fast, Goldfish around turn 4. Goldfish means if there's no opponent, it'll kill the opponent by turn 4 generally. Suicide Black can Goldfish on turn 2 or 3, depending on the version and the ritual draw. So ritual draw meaning dark ritual. So if you play like dark ritual into like triple Carnophage or something like that, then you can like hit your opponent for massive amounts of damage very early in the game. Clearly, the Suicide Black deck has to be the beatdown deck, and the Slide deck has to be the control deck. However, Suicide Black can't afford to be the beatdown deck. It can't lay many of its clocks, especially Sarcomancy or Flesh Reaver, because the Slide deck has so many bolts. It can almost never cast Hatred for fear of an auto loss to an Incinerate, so you just deal 3 damage. So it can't really beat down, because normally the way Hatred would work is you pay like 19 life and hit your opponent for 19 extra damage or whatever it is, but you just lose to them burning you out then. So it can't really beat down. The Suicide Black deck has to try to be the control deck. Anyone who has ever witnessed this matchup, at least when the Slide deck gets a decent draw, knows how well control-oriented Suicide Black turns out. So obviously, this is just basically saying that it doesn't really work out very well for Suicide Black. Misassignment of roles equals game loss. After sideboarding, the Suicide Black deck has traditionally done much better by taking a lot of its Damage Myself cards for creature removal and life gaining. It can play the control role more adequately and has a much improved, if not great, chance of winning. So basically, even though you lose game 1 super badly trying to play the control role, you still identify that control role and then try to modify your deck post board to do that. But yeah, that is the article. It's a key piece of strategy. The key takeaway is that if you're playing a match of Magic, be that constructed, be that limited, you want to figure out if you're the deck that has essentially these 3 things. The more damage, which generally is like, you can also think of that as like cheaper cards that are going to do more damage earlier in the game. Removal, because you want to be the one that can answer all of your opponent's threats. And if you have more permission in card drawing, you're generally the late game control deck. If you think your deck is like in limited in particular, if you have a late game bomb, then oftentimes you're going to be the control deck, because if you just stall the game and draw that bomb, you're going to win the game. But if you then are playing the match and you realize your opponent has an even better bomb than you, then all of a sudden you realize that you have to be the beatdown deck maybe for games 2 and 3, because if they draw your bomb, they're going to win if they draw their bomb, they're going to win the game. In constructed, this applies to a lot of matchups, especially between things like mono white versus mono red, where maybe you have a couple of 4-mana planeswalkers and they don't. And so you can just be like, okay, if I stall the game and just trade off creatures in the early turns, I can eventually win the game with my planeswalker while they can't. And so this can oftentimes be a factor in sideboarding as well. If you're playing like mono red versus mono red, and you have like the exact same list, it's a little bit different, but like if you're on the draw, then you're generally not going to be the beatdown. So that's kind of the way you can think about that as well. So instead of lightning bolting your opponent's face, you're going to want to lightning bolt their creature to control the game in that manner. So this is a huge level up article. I really hope you enjoyed seeing the breakdown and having some of the context explained, because it's a great article, but it is kind of hard to get some of the references if you don't do a bunch of research on your own sometimes. So hopefully this helped clarify things. If you did enjoy this video, let me know in the comment section down below. And to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video, leave hashtag beatdownmaster, because you now know who's the beatdown, and you're going to be ready to apply this knowledge to your own games. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk to you next time.